And the irony is, of course, as you referred to earlier, there are materials. Scales has done a very good job in a lot of cases, as we said, probably under-resourced, but done some good materials. When we did our State of School survey recently, it was I think one of the biggest surprises was how few teachers had been offered even the opportunity to use those resources, and more importantly, to be trained in the use of those resources.
Yes, there's no point in having them if you can't get access to them in a timely way and in a way that doesn't add to your workload.
And Colin, all of this, as we can see, builds up for teachers. And where that's coming to a head is in burnout, satisfaction, intention to leave. Again, in that State of School survey, I think we were all stunned a couple of years ago, within the union even, where the number of people who'd considered leaving in the previous 4 years was 81%. That's even higher now. It's up at about 86%, where people are seriously considering leaving. A story that's been reflected recently in a broader public sector survey, which has put the levels of consideration of leaving the public sector completely highly. Both of you have been very strong public servants and public advocates over the years. It must be incredibly disappointing right across the board, but particularly in terms of education.
Oh, it's hugely disappointing and understandable given the changes that have happened across the board in education, not just in this state, right across the world. And probably systems haven't actually caught up with them. But if you look at what most workforces, individuals in workforces want, is they want to actually have certainty and consistency. And what has happened as a result of things like the IPS, there's been a range of inconsistencies applied in terms of selection, in terms of appointment. And all of those contribute then to other factors, such as the curriculum being not quite set in terms of where teachers would like it. And that's in part because we have a NAPLAN pressure. So we put more effort into NAPLAN than we do into the rest of the curriculum. And we need to actually readdress that. So all of those things, as Carmen has said before, all of those things contribute to poor thinking about how I feel about my job and about myself in that job, and therefore, is there an alternative? We need to have a look at how do we address retention in a much broader way and do that by having a look at all of the facets of what we're asking teachers to do and how we can support them. And I think there's an opportunity through this report. One of the things that we've been really, really pleased with, as Carmen has said earlier in the podcast, all of these recommendations are doable. They're logical, they're practical. Many of them don't require a lot of money, but they will provide a great deal of satisfaction within the workforce and a great deal of control back into teachers and principals' hands to actually get the job done.
And Carmen, as we move from that, there are some worrying stats. We don't like to talk about crisis because we're focused on positive solutions, but you found that attendance and retention rates are declining. The performance on national international tests is getting worse. The ATAR rates at the moment are significantly lower than the national average. There is a considerable level of inequality and stagnating educational performance in WA in particular and across the country. And students are finding that you're finding they're reporting little enjoyment and satisfaction. It becomes a really vicious circle, doesn't it? Because the students are unhappy, the teachers get unhappier.
That's right, because every teacher I've ever met wants to have a positive experience in the classroom for their students, for themselves. You know, they are unhappy with these poorer outcomes. Many of them are across the system. They're not just in the public system, it has to be said. And one of the most amazing things, aside from those difficulties that you've mentioned, is that the public education system, miraculously almost, delivers the same or better outcomes when you take account of a social background and disadvantage that the highly funded private schools do. So despite these problems that we're confronting, and I think many of them are a tipping point, you know, attendance rates and completion rates and so on, these are important, particularly for some groups in regional Western Australia, Aboriginal kids in particular. But having said that, teachers actually do a fantastic job under pressure in delivering outcomes that are at least equivalent to the private school sector, and in some cases better. We found some data that showed that the declines, not that this is much to write home about, but the declines in the public sector in some of these international tests were smaller than the declines in the private sector. So the redistribution of funds is very important, I think, to try and remedy some of these problems and to assist teachers in delivering even better results for the poorer, most disadvantaged students in our communities. Yeah.
It's an old-fashioned term, I know, but teaching has long been seen as a calling, and I think your findings reflect that, don't they? Teachers are not complaining about teaching; they love teaching.
Yeah.
It's the add-ons to the teaching that is frustrating them. Is that fair to say, Colin?
Oh, absolutely. And you mentioned earlier about the 4 pages of policy changes that is found in the report. I think if you reflect on each one of those and the demands it place on a classroom teacher, it's huge. And we need to stop and have a look at how we can support teachers in a much better way than just overlaying policy after policy.
Carmen, you just mentioned Aboriginal education. We've also referred to the fact that at one point WA was supposed to be getting extra funding to recognise that there were extra needs in certain areas of the state, particularly in the light of the recent referendum disappointment. It's probably more important now than ever to deliver something really positive to help First Nations people, particularly their youth. Take us through some of the discussions and recommendations that you've made in that area.
Well, we were very clear that there were additional problems, that as well as poverty and educational disadvantage that attached particularly to Aboriginal students in the more remote parts of the state. And without wanting it to in a sense, use a deficit model, because that can be very insulting to Aboriginal people as well, we nonetheless were very clear-eyed about the fact that the way the education system works at the moment isn't helping. And in some ways it may be making things worse. The high turnover, young teachers, burnout, all of these things, teachers not supported with cultural awareness. We think it's time for there to be a highly focused unit within the education department focused on educational needs of Aboriginal students in Western Australia, and an elite workforce who are properly rewarded and supported and have proper cultural training in advance of taking up these positions, rather than relying on whoever you can entice for a short period of time and the high turnover. These people, and Colin met with quite a few of them in the Kimberley, are very hard working, but the odds against them succeeding are really stacked. I don't know, Colin, you want to add?
Oh, absolutely. And we continue to go and find a solution rather than go and ask people on the ground, how can we actually make this a better place and a better way of educating our young Aboriginal people, particularly in remote communities. And unfortunately, the overwhelming response we had was we get yet another program given to us that we have to implement that has very little relevance to the local community. And so we need to actually rethink that whole approach to Aboriginal education. And as Carmen said, we're really keen to have an expert unit do the complete process for Aboriginal education. So not just the curriculum, not just cultural awareness, but appointment, support, all of the things that need to make a successful community needs to be on the ground, and we need to have those experts well paid, and then you see in some of the recommendations, have access back to locations or preferred locations if that's what they want.
So that you get the best in place for the time that they can spend there, and that they don't burn out in that environment either, and everybody hopefully benefits.
That's right. And obviously consulting all the while with both experts in Indigenous education. Many Aboriginal people would want to contribute, and also the local community. So it's informed by the differences between many of these communities, that it's not a one-size-fits-all. That's why you need, sophisticated people involved in this process, that they know they don't have to learn on the job.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then I think in summary then, when we look at this review, and I think this has been quite an encouraging discussion, and I hope our members and the parents and those who are listening to this podcast feel that too, whilst there are underlying problems and there are some very serious issues that need addressing, it seems that both of you have found that the people engaged in the system, the teachers, are doing a pretty good job. They just need that extra support. They need less non-teaching workload, and that both students and teachers need that professional support at all levels. And whilst the system is at a point where it needs to improve dramatically, there is hope and a way to do this. What is the way to move forward, as you've recommended it in the report?
Well, we suggest that it needs to be an implementation committee, if the government were willing, obviously, involving both the President of the Teachers Union and the Director General of Education, so that these recommendations aren't left to gather dust, that they actually can be implemented, modified, depending on the times and the people involved, but clearly facing the facts, which is what we've called the report. We can continue to pretend that all is well in education, or we can face the facts. And I think that needs a good, solidly resourced committee to implement it, taking account of all the observations we've made about workload. You don't want to add to teachers' workload and increase burnout. Teaching is a wonderful vocation, I think, and that's a good way to think about it. And I've got many teachers in my family, nieces, nephews, sisters, all of whom have been delighted to work with young people. But we can't ask people to do that shouldering a burden that should be spread more evenly. So some of what's needed in education is actually for other areas of government service to be provided. Health, for
it is
example.
indeed health and the other support services
right.
that we need around the place. Well, Carmen, or Dr. Lawrence, Colin, thank you so much for your role. Thank you to your fellow panellists who, it's been over a year, I think, since this process first began. You've travelled all over the state. You've listened to many, many people and have delivered a report that offers not just problems but hope. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for joining us on Western Teacher Live.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Western Teacher Live, cutting through noise on public education and union issues.